Okay, thank you. So today's topic is going to be the universality of sense, and this topic is an answer to a debate I recently had with Meillassoux in Paris, because Meillassoux objected to my notion of existence, that it was secretly universalist. Okay, so now I'm addressing the issue. Okay, just for some people who haven't been there, I can't do a full update like I did yesterday, because the update would now take me, given that I've yesterday, just believe me that I've proven that existence is the relation of appearing in the world and not the relation of falling under a concept. Okay, so contra Frege. So I started with some Fregean considerations, but then said, instead of thinking, so existence is neither set membership nor the relation of falling under a concept, but is what I call appearance in the field of sense. So there's no difference between appearance and existence, which is why I hold that there are police uniform wearing female unicorns on the backside of the moon, for example, in the thought that I just entertained. Okay, so I'm not saying that there are these kinds of unicorns in the world of spatial temporal objects. Okay, but still my ontology is wild enough to allow for everything. So I regard my whole ontology as an analysis of the trivial fact that everything exists. Okay, so there's nothing which doesn't exist. But of course I can explain non-existence, where non-existence is a trans-field appearance. So it is the case that there are no, when I say that there are no unicorns on the backside of the moon, then I'm saying that in a particular field of sense there are no unicorns on the backside of the moon. I'm not saying there are no unicorns tout court, because existence is never tout court. So I'm a full-fledged relativist about existence. Okay, so this is like a background story. So how does this chime, if it does, with universalism? So this is what I'm going to address today, and I will start with Frege, give Frege a pervert turn, and then you'll see where I'm heading. The very point of Frege's notion of sense is its objectivity. As Frege puts it in his allegory of the telescope, which will be in the center today, sense is active in the orientation of any cognitive achievement whatsoever. Whenever we grasp a truth-apt thought, this thought achieves its goal, namely truth, always only in a particular manner defined by the very concepts that go into the thought. So there's no such thing as truth. You know, that just doesn't make sense. There's only truth which comes with an access to truth. Okay, so this is Frege's point, that there's no reference without mode of presentation. But I will prove this today in a different way from Frege. So there's no such thing as the attainment or achievement of truth, but always only particular and yet objective paths to truth. For example, I might gain access to the same truth with the obviously different thoughts, T1, that Arnold Schwarzenegger is the 38th governor of California, and T2, that the actor who played Hercules in New York is the 38th governor of California. Even though it is presumably the same fact that is capable of verifying both T1 and T2, T1 and T2 are different. They differ in the mode of access brought about by the concepts, or in this case, by the proper names or descriptions entering the respective thoughts. At the same time, the different senses associated with the different thoughts are as objective as any cognitive achievement gets. So there's just nothing subjective about Hercules in New York. Okay, so there's something subjective about the way we like it or don't. Okay, so I think it's a bad movie. But even that, you know, that I think that it's a bad movie is objective. Okay, it is my it belongs to my subjectivity. But of course, you can understand that Markus Gabriel thinks that Hercules in New York is a worse movie than I don't know, Déjeuner sur l'herbe. This is more obvious in another Fregean example, namely in the case of mathematical equations. To assert that 3 plus 1 equals 2 plus 2 is to assert that the two senses S1, 3 plus 1, and S2, 2 plus 2, are different modes of presentation of the same, for example, the number 4. Now, there's nothing particularly or inherently subjective about either 3 plus 1 or 2 plus 2. Even if I might have a different mental image or be in a different overall psychological state than another person when we both think that 3 plus 1 equals 4, this difference is not necessarily reflected in the thought that we both grasp, even though this thought is a particular objective mode of access. So what Frege calls, and that's something people have totally forgotten, it's important but I won't go into this today, Frege says, you know, If I don't like that 3 plus 1 equals 4, which might be the case, I don't like that 3 plus 1 equals 4, then the fact that I don't like that 3 plus 1 equals 4 does not go into the sense of 3 plus 1, okay, but is what he calls coloring or lighting. There's something, you know, like Frege's Heraclitean there, okay? Lightning gathers everything. So there's some lightning or coloring. Okay, but that's a different thing for Frege, okay? When I say I don't like that 3 plus 1 equals 4, but that's not the sense. Otherwise, it wouldn't be the thought that 3 plus 1 equals 4, but any other thought. For example, that it feels silly that 3 plus 1 equals 4, or that I don't like that 3 plus 1 equals 4. In his allegory of the telescope, Frege puts this thought thusly, I quote, "Somebody observes the moon through a telescope. I compare the moon itself to the reference. It is the object of the observation, mediated by the real image projected by the object glass in the interior of the telescope, and by the retinal image of the observer. The former I compare to the sense, the latter is like the idea or experience. The optical image in the telescope is indeed one-sided and dependent upon the standpoint of observation, but it is still objective, inasmuch as it can be used by several observers." End of quote. So allegory of the telescope. Note, he uses an allegory. Okay, that's important. Frege, because Frege holds, like we have seen in the first lecture, that by necessity we cannot speak about concepts without metaphors. Okay, because speaking about a concept is turning a concept into the object position, it ceases being a concept. Which is why Frege's paradox holds that the concept horse is not a concept. It is the following is true: the concept horse is not a concept. Given that this is true according to the object-concept distinction, which is necessary for his overall ontology, he necessarily uses an allegory in order to talk about sense, the difference between sense and reference. And he does it self-aware, okay? So I'm not deconstructing Frege, okay? He knows what he's doing. Remarkably, Husserlian spatial horizons, adumbrations, Abschattungen, are objective in that sense too. To see the cup from here, from where I currently sit, is a particular perspective available to anyone who can put herself into my current spatial position. Here, it doesn't matter whether it is actually possible for anyone to literally occupy my current spatial position, such that it would be the same in all respects, for it would at the very least differ in time. So if you come here and sit here, you know, there will always be one difference, namely that I just sat here and that now you are sitting here. So the overall spatial temporal position, of course, necessarily differs. The point is that there's nothing inherently subjective and therefore potentially distorting about perspective, mode of presentation, or sense. Okay, and that's the original notion of Italian notion of perspective, of course. Okay, so perspectivism has never, like from Italian Renaissance to Leibniz, has not been a bad thing. So perspectivism is just fine. It's almost trivial. Okay, so there's nothing subjective about perspective. It's not a Nietzschean kind of perspective. Even Nietzsche is not that stupid, right? But it's not a Nietzschean kind of perspective where perspective is like, oh, something totally private. You can't get my perspective. Okay, so there's no such thing as my perspective. The objectivity of sense and the achievement of truth does not endorse either a claim to infallibility, guaranteed truth, or even full transparency of thought. The ontology of fields of sense actually installs a constitutive withdrawal at the last instance of its reflection, a withdrawal resulting from the essential incompleteness of reality as such. For those who haven't been present, just think of the essential incompleteness of reality in terms of standard set theoretical arguments of the type of Cantor's theorem. The arguments are actually different, but that might be sufficient. So if you think, you know, if reality were complete, there would be an algorithm which would run over all of reality, such that there is no entity not encompassed by this algorithm, but there can be no such algorithm because the algorithm itself would have to exist. Therefore, you would always need a meta-algorithm, both encompassing that over which the algorithm runs and the algorithm. But there's no such thing on pain of infinite regress. Okay, so this is one way of just getting this insight. It's actually much more complicated, as I've tried to show yesterday, but think of it as, you know, that might be sufficient to say reality is incomplete. The essential incompleteness of reality can be argued for along the lines of the most fundamental insight of field ontology, namely that ontological determinacy presupposes accessibility. As I have argued in the first 2 lectures, whatsoever exists in a field of sense. Let me just mention en passant that in my view, this was the basic point of Derrida's insistence on contextuality in his polemics with Searle, where Derrida explicitly equates this with his notorious claim that there's nothing outside of a text or of the text, in part of the text. Derrida, of course, was not stupid, and he did not want to say, well, you think it's a table, but it's a text. Okay, Derrida did not have a revisionary theory of cups, according to which cups are really texts. Okay, so this is the standard American interpretation of Derrida, which is to say it's not an interpretation. Okay, so it's just, you know, like Searle does not like Derrida, and he thinks that Derrida thinks that cups are really texts. Okay, so Kafka's trial and my car are ontologically the same. No. Okay, Derrida of course understood that this is not the same. To achieve, and of course, he's always said that text is a metaphor. Okay, when he says this, people are like, oh, then text is just a metaphor. And Derrida goes, duh, of course this is just a metaphor. This is the beginning of my theory, my friend. The metaphor. Okay, but I won't go into Derrida. I'm just saying that Derrida was never as stupid as his critics thought he was, which is most often the case. With criticism. To achieve the relevant insight, which will serve as one of the central constraints for the further development of today's thought, let's return to the Phrygian example of equations as his paradigm case for identity statements. If the equal sign in any equation expresses the fact that the 2 sides of the equation are different modes of presentation of the same, that's Frege, what then is the same in the particular case of the equation 3 + 1 = 2 + 2. So what's the sameness? The natural answer to this question would be 4. That's, of course, the official Phrygian doctrine. It therefore seems as if 4, no quotes, is the identity of 3 + 1 and 2 + 2, their referent or reference in Frege's use of the term. However, and now here comes a problem, it is equally true that 3 + 1 = 4. This means that 4, no quotes, would have to be a mode, 4 quotes would have to be a mode of presentation of 4, no quotes. The reference itself would have to become a sense. Okay? So if 4, no quotes, is the reference of both 3 + 1 quotes and 2 + 2 quotes, okay, and if that is the meaning of the equal sign, okay, namely 4 in this case, then what is the meaning of the equal sign in the case of 3 + 1 = 4? So the only answer you would have is 4, right? But then this means that 4 quotes can be a mode of presentation of 4 no quotes. And the question is whether this is a consistent thought. Now, the problem is that any sign whatsoever has to be associated with a particular mode of presentation according to Frege, as he said in the quote that I quoted yesterday, where he surprisingly says that in order for us to know any reference of any term, okay, we would have to know all the senses associated with it, quote, to such knowledge we never attain, which is why Frege is not capable of refuting semantic nihilism, which would be the claim that no sign whatsoever has any meaning. Okay, that would be semantic nihilism, and according to Frege we cannot refute this. Okay, so meaning, Fregean meaning, that is the existence of anything which is not itself a sign, is always only a semantic presupposition. Because there is no universal mode of presentation, which is a universal truth about sense, or which rather is the very universality of sense. Let's see how that works. So I'm claiming the only universal mode of presentation is that there is none. Given that modes of presentations are modes of presentation of something, we have to reach the bedrock of something which does not further present anything, but which rather is presented. If there were no such ontological bedrock, we would run the risk of emptying sense out of any content. That might be Derrida then. Now, if 4 were already the bedrock of all its modes of presentation, it could itself not present anything. It could not be a mode of presentation. Yet it evidently is a mode of presentation because it suffices for something being a mode of presentation to appear on any side of an equation with a determinable truth value. Therefore, 3 + 1, 2 + 2, and 4 turn out to equally be modes of presentation. But presentations of what? At this point, it is possible to draw a remarkable and somewhat surprising parallel to Schelling's notion of the non-ground, Ungrund, in his essay on the essence of human freedom. There, Schelling approaches the same issue within his own theory of identity underlying his ontological project. In his ontology, the question I raised in this lecture, namely the question, what is the bedrock of presentation, which is ultimately presented by all modes of presentation without by necessity ever being identical with any particular mode, leads Schelling to the postulation of the paradoxical concept of, I quote, a predicate of predicatelessness. Okay? The predicate of predicatelessness. That would be that which is presented by all of modes of presentation without itself ever being in the position of being a mode of presentation. Senseless reference, okay? Predicate of predicatelessness. This predicate results from Schelling's claim that spirit or love, as he puts it with St. John and St. Paul respectively, are the highest. Spirit here and everywhere else in German idealism only refers to the fact of intelligibility, namely, that there's something accessible to thought rather than nothing. So when the German idealists say spirit, they generally just mean that there's something accessible to thought rather than nothing. That's spirit. Spirit means, oh, there's a bottle, that's spirit. Okay, I can understand something, okay, something is accessible to thought. This is what they mean by spirit. So spirit is neither an entity, nor is it even a surprising claim. Okay, if you deny spirit, that's pretty bad. So you can't even deny spirit. So that's the basic claim. Spirit just means any domain of intelligibility. And then they started talking about, then the debate started. So what then is spirit? What constitutes it? Are there many realms of spirit or whatever? But like that seems to be the basic claim. Spirit is thus Schelling's name for the existence of sense and not some ghost-like appearance or other weird hyperphysical entity. There are no hyperphysical entities in German idealism. On the contrary, the whole thing was constructed against Kant's claim to hyperphysical entities. Okay, so the project of Fichte, Schelling, and Hegel was to say, well, look, this Kant guy has a notion of the thing in itself, and that's a hyperphysical entity. We need to get rid of this because this is metaphysics. Yeah. So how can we be Kant without thing in itself? That was the question. So they did not introduce some weird thing in itself, you know, like souls or whatever. But on the contrary, they wanted to be completely deflationary. Okay, but they used, and I think even ironically, I think this was a bunch of funny people. Okay, so they spoke a high poetic language. Okay, like they said things such as whatever, absolute spirit is its own manifestation. So this sounds like, wow, you know, God is creating himself or whatever. But what they just said is that, oh, I can understand that I can understand something. So that's absolute spirit self-manifestation. Okay, I can understand that I can understand something. So very trivial. Now, this existence, namely the existence of sense, refers to something which antecedes it as that which is present in any mode of presentation. Schelling carefully designates this antecedent referent of all modes of presentation as a dash in his text, adding dash. How should we designate it? So Schelling is about, you know, he goes on. So what is the thing in itself, as it were, right? So what's the reality which presents itself in all the modes of presentations? Okay, and then he doesn't find the word for it, and then suddenly dash in the text. How should we designate it? Question mark. Next paragraph. He then goes on to designate the dash as the non-ground, a term later replaced by the term unprethinkable being, which doesn't matter here. So then he calls the dash in the text the non-ground. All modes of, so the text is opening upon something, okay, which is not set in the text. So you only have a dash in the text, an empty place in the text, okay, which is a representation of the fact that the text is talking about something. So how do you represent in the text that the text is talking about something? You always need, okay, metalinguistic devices. Okay, in this case, it's the dash in the text, and then Schelling refers to the dash in the text, and you think he's referring to something else. How should we designate it? So he's playing with the fact that he's writing a text. All modes of presentation are ultimately identical in that they refer to the placeholder of their identity. That which is expressed in the equal sign without itself being something equal. For this reason, Schelling refers to this dimension as, that's a quote, the unequal with itself. The unequal, das sich selbst ungleiche. The unequal with itself. The unequal with itself, or if you prefer Adorno to Schelling, the non-identical, is a necessary presupposition of spirit or of sense. It is that to which everything refers, which is itself necessarily senseless and thus without the capacity to refer to anything. In this precise sense, Schelling calls unprethinkable being blind. It is governed, as he puts it, by a blind necessity. Okay? So, according to him, everything, the realm of sense, is rooted in what he calls blind necessity. And, but whenever you say what blind necessity is, okay, this is maybe a problem Stefan raised yesterday with his talk. So whenever you say what the, to go a little bit back to the conference, so whenever you say what the x is, which counts as y and z, okay, you determine the x as something, okay, and then it's already on this side of sense. Okay, so when you say, oh, the banknote is really just atoms and the void, okay, then you forget that atoms and the void are, again, modes of presentations of what? They count as, atoms and the void count as something in. Okay, they are themselves counted. So what is this blind necessity, is Schelling's question. What is like the bedrock of signification? Another case in point is Wittgenstein's insight that interpretations come to an end. At the end of interpretation, there is what Wittgenstein calls blind rule following, which is to say an event which does not intrinsically refer to anything else. It is that which is presented in every mode of presentation without ever being identical with any mode of presentation. For this reason, it is not possible to say that 4 is a mode of presentation of 4, where the second mention of 4 in the previous clause of this sentence would be meant as a raw stand-in of reference in the realm of intelligibility, thought, or sense. Here, it does not matter yet which conception of the relation between bedrock and sense we prefer, if there is any relation. Among other things, it will be necessary to deal with the question whether the bedrock even stands in any relation. Skepticism, for example, can be understood as the claim that there is either no such relation, or that, even if there were a relevant relation, we could not at the same time stand in this relation and access the relation in a truth-apt thought. Okay, so you can see skepticism, okay, as a claim to the possibility of semantic nihilism. So the skeptic says that you might never know whether anything which might refer to something actually refers to something. Okay, that's the Cartesian evil genius. In the evil genius case, okay, you don't even know whether 3 plus 1 equals 4. Why? Because you don't even know whether 3 plus 1 equals 4 refers to anything whatsoever. Okay, and when you try to establish that there is such a reference, okay, you will always use another proposition which is supposed to have a referent. Okay, so you can never guarantee that in the act of operation that the operation is successful. Okay, and if you generalize this, what you get is the possibility of semantic nihilism, and as always, the skeptic does not need to prove that semantic nihilism is true, but only that he can prove that it's false. So, this raises the issue of universality. Despite my explicit commitment to the plurivocity of being and my equation of being with field relative appearance, I constantly quantify over all objects when I say, quote myself, that whatsoever exists has to be able to appear in a field of sense. Is the claim that existence is field relative appearance universal, and what could universality here possibly mean? What is the relation between this universality and necessity? Is my argument a chain of reasons forged in the melting pot of merciless necessity, governed by the hardness of the logical must? And if it isn't, what am I doing? And if it's not, if contingency indeed has the last word, as I tend to argue, how exactly do I prevent my argument from falling into the abyss of arbitrariness? To address this important set of questions, it is first crucial to briefly recapitulate my claim to analogy rather than universality. Being in the existential sense is field relative appearance. Now, for something to appear in a field of sense, there are always rules involved governing the arrangement into which it is projected. This should be illustrated with the help of a few examples so that you can see what this might mean. There are numbers and there's addition, so 3 plus 1 equals 4. This equation exists, among other things, in the very field of basic arithmetic. In order for it to exist in this field, it has to meet a number of conditions. It has to be governed by the rules of addition, it has to be compatible with the basic laws of mathematical logic, and as such it should simply not be, it should not simply be regarded as a physical truth, 3 drops of water added to 1 drop of water do not equal 4 drops of water, but just 1. Okay, so 3 plus 1 equals 4 is not a physical truth. It's actually false in the realm of physics, because if I add 3 drops of water to 1 drop of water, I don't get 4, but just 1 drop of water. Therefore, addition doesn't hold 4 drops. Drops are a counterexample to addition if you read it this way. So therefore, it is a constitutive rule of arithmetic addition to be distinguishable from other forms of addition, such as adding drops of water to drops of water. Okay, we call this add in normal language, in everyday language. Let's just add 3 drops of water to 1 drop of water, but this is not addition. It's not the same when we say let's add 3 to 1. Okay. So obviously there's a semantic rule, okay, a constitutive rule distinguishing addition in the mathematical sense from addition in the water case. The same holds for subtraction or division. If I divide a human being by 2, I do not get 2 human beings as a result, but even none. So in the case of a human being, okay, if I divide 1 by 2, I don't get a half or anything, I get none. Okay, it's an act of killing. Division can thus be annihilating. Some people believe, worms might be different, and water is different, of course. Okay, but then of course there's some vague cases. What happens if Moses divides the Red Sea or whichever sea it was into 2? Did he just create the Blue Sea and the Red Sea? Okay, all these rules go into our recognition of the chain of science. 3 plus 1 equals 4, insofar as an arithmetical sense is attached to them. That is to say, insofar as they actually appear in the field of sense of arithmetic. However, the signs 3 plus 1 equals 4 might also appear in the field of sense of this paper here in front of me. In this case, there would be no precise delineation between type and token. All the various tokens of the chain of signs 3 plus 1 equals 4 in this paper here, in this case I counted them correctly 3, are different if I take their position on this paper into account. Believe me, there are currently 3 tokens of 3 plus 1 equals 4 on this paper, including the one which mentions that there are only 3. In this field of sense, they are quite different in sense from the arithmetical truths or theorems. They cannot be derived from any mathematically relevant set of premises with mathematically relevant rules of inference plus a mathematically relevant intelligent cognition transforming science according to the rules of arithmetic. But they can easily be derived by looking at the paper and counting the tokens. The rules of text production are very different from the rules of arithmetic. Also, natural laws constitute fields of sense. In the ontology I am defending here, a volcano exploding in a galaxy so far away from our planet that we will never observe it or its traces in any future moment of human cognitive history is as much a field of sense as an itch on my toe, as resentment, politics, or subatomic shaky events as yet undecided between their realization as a wave or a particle. In this respect, natural laws are indeed rules constituting a field of sense, and it doesn't matter that they cannot be transgressed like human law. That might go into their specificity, but it doesn't matter from a purely ontological point of view. Okay? Which is why I literally hold that, for example, arithmetic is not bound by the laws of nature, or text production. Text production is not bound by the laws of nature, because you don't understand text production by understanding the laws of nature. Okay? It's a simple category mistake. Yeah. If you ask, so if you try to look into the laws of nature, which made me write this paper, okay, it's not only the case that you might have to tell a very, very long story, and you need to call Laplace's demon in order to get a story beginning from the Big Bang to me writing 3 tokens of 3 plus 1 equals 4 on the last paper. Okay, it's not only very difficult to tell the story, okay, but it's also a stupid question. So if you ask, how did it come about in the physical universe that Markus Gabriel wrote 3 tokens of 3 plus 1 equals 4 on the last paper, to which he's just referring in this sentence? If that is your question, well, you're just asking a stupid question, okay? Because in the physical universe, in my sense, I don't even exist. Markus Gabriel does not exist in the physical universe, because if you just ask Werner Heisenberg, when he gives a lecture on physics, no such thing as people, okay, are part of this lecture. He will talk about waves and particles and whatever, okay, but he simply won't talk about people, which is not to say that people are really waves or particles, okay. That's just stupid. Whenever you say any such thing as something is really this, and this means that you reduce an entity from one field of sense to an entity in another field of sense, you're just making a mistake or a political statement. It might be a political act. Okay, so you might say that this country is really that other country. Okay, or you might say this, but then it's political, which means invasion. Okay, so there is field of sense reduction, okay, but then field of sense reduction, but then of course there's different field of sense reduction. There's no such thing, as I proved, which is easy to prove, as an algorithm running over all fields of sense, which is why there's no issue of determinism versus free will. All these issues immediately disappear if that's the ontology. Okay, I don't even understand these issues. So, as an answer to Meya Su's question as to the status of universality in my project, I would like to, because of course whenever you use the word relative, someone will shout you're a relativist, okay? And then someone will shout that now you can really just go about and kill people on the street, okay? Because there are no laws which bind humans together. That's the usual question you always get, Just ask Dick Rorty who had to listen to this for 50 years of his life. As soon as he published, his first book, everyone's like, oh, so you can kill anyone, and then okay, but so I need to answer this here. In order to answer this, the question as to the status of universality, I would like to introduce the distinction between a flat and a curved logical space. Flat and curved logical space. If it were helpful, but it would complicate the issue, but that might be interesting for you, there is a predecessor to this distinction, of course, in Deleuze. Okay, so what I call the flat logical space for Deleuzians is just the plane of immanence. Okay, whereas curved logical space is the curvature of logical space he's describing in terms of the other forms of image. So, but okay, brackets closed. So ontology, in my sense, is the theory of the flat logical space from the perspective of curved logical space. In flat logical space, all inscriptions, everything which appears in it, are just objects. That is, some things which exist insofar as they appear, and appear as contents for truth apt thought, as possible reference targets. In flat logical space, no decision has been made between a true and a false thought, for from an ontological point of view, they both simply exist. Okay, so think of flat logical space as of, say, the inscription of P and not P. Okay, for example, someone believes that the Earth is round, and someone else believes that the Earth is flat. Okay, so ontologically, both thoughts just exist, which is why people could believe or could have believed that the Earth is flat, if anyone ever believed this. Okay, but let's say someone really believed this. Okay, so you can only believe these entertained false thoughts. Okay, precisely because they exist. So you can grasp a false thought because there are false thoughts. In this sense, in flat logical space, in other words, things merely are. To borrow a phrase Simon Critchley used in his reading of Wallace Stevens' poetry. Again, with Critchley, you could see this in Levinas' Il y a. The there is anteceding there's this and that. Okay, so there's a distinction between il y a, there is in Levinas, and there's this and that. Okay, so it's the there is flat. Okay, because there's everything. But you decide, because there's everything, but still you might be a vegetarian. Given that there's everything doesn't mean that you start eating trees or cars or pigs. Okay, it's all there, but you make a choice. Okay, and once you make a choice, you have what I call a curved logical space, and the curvature of logical space can simply be described as the game of giving and asking for reasons. Okay, so in my reading in Pittsburgh, what you get is a theory of curved logical space. In flat logical space, the Pyrrhonian skeptical equivalence principle holds, according to which every proposition is as strong as every other, even if there are actual incompatibilities, because they both merely are. In curved logical space, an asymmetry is established because there are various paths of justification which support a particular proposition in its opposition to another. In other words, flat logical space is completely anarchical, whereas curved logical space consists of various patterns of hierarchization and power. Okay, so here let me allow to say, everything's will to power. So to say something which sounds a little bit sexier than flat and curved logical space, but of course I don't mean it. Thus, ontology partly deals with a universal structure of equivalence, the mere being there of propositions and fields of sense, but at the same time describes the transition from flat to curved logical space, an idea which, by the way, corresponds to Badiou's project, but okay, of what he calls transitory ontology. Nevertheless, the universality of sense is not present in any particularity as such. It only manifests itself in the void's various forms of surrounding determinate fields of sense, in the paradoxical inexhaustibility of nothingness. The relation of appearing in the world, and therefore existence, is governed by rules, which can be very different from one field of sense to the other. For this reason, the universality of sense does not exist, for existence is already particular. As Badiou says, who would probably agree with many aspects of the ontology developed here, even though he would restrict this to what he calls transcendental logics, I quote, "Discontinuity between worlds is the law of appearance," end of quote. For this reason, we often get easily confused when moving or being moved through fields of sense, because this is what's happening all the time. We're constantly en passant. Okay, we're always between one field and sense of the other. You know, you listen to a philosophy lecture such as this one, or you participate in a conference, and then you go for dinner. Okay, and then maybe at dinner you're thinking, oh, this is not really me, this is just atoms and the void. Okay, and then you're moving to another field of sense. Then you start dreaming. Then you're a little bit bored. Then you're really happy, and so forth. Okay, and in every at every step you have a transition from one field of sense to the next. And it always takes energy to remain within one field of sense. To be precise, we inhabit a transfinite amount of fields of sense at the same time. We are ourselves objects in transfinitely many worlds. Ontologically, the same is at the same time transfinitely many things, relative to transfinitely many fields of sense, and is only determined in the curvature of logical space. This already raises the issue I have been avoiding until now, namely whether 3 + 1 = 4 is actually the same independently of its position in a field of sense. So again, Professor Babic, so sameness, the issue of sameness comes back here. Is there some underlying thing, the same, entering different fields of sense, or is the same not rather a side effect of the plurality of fields? As you might imagine, I opt for the second version. Let me sum this option up in the slogan, okay? And German philosophers at some point need to have a slogan, right? Everything's will to power, everything's class struggle. So here's the suggestion for a slogan: being is belated retrojection. Of course, I will explain this to a certain degree, but I will leave some things open. Otherwise, I could not suggest that you should start interpreting this and waste your time on my bullshit. The underlying identity is only ever retroactively or belatedly established as soon as fields of sense enter a descent, whereby I repeat another insight of early Derrida, captured in his notion of dissension. The details of this part would have been spelled out in lecture 4. For now, it might be helpful to underpin my intuitions with some references to the tradition. Maybe that's helpful. No, I skip Leibniz and Giordano Bruno. Okay, allow me to retranslate this once more into the seemingly more deflationary demeanor of Gottlob Frege. Okay, so I just had a detour into Giordano Bruno, and now I'm coming back to common sense Gottlob Frege. 3 + 1 and 2 + 2 are senses of the same reference. For the sake of argument, let us pick this out with the help of the sign 4, and say that 3 + 1 and 2 + 4 are indeed senses of 4, or as one might also put it, they are about 4. Now, the very fact that there is something is of or is about only becomes salient after there is a plurality of senses of excesses. 3 + 1 alone does not signify anything potentially different from it. The difference between 3 + 1 and 2 + 2 is our excess condition to the identity of 4, which differs from the difference between 3 + 1 and 2 + 2. So we only understand, okay, that there is identity because we grasp the difference of modes of presentation. So the concept of identity, not what is identical, okay? The concept of identity is sense dependent on the concept of difference. Okay, let me just repeat, because not everyone was present yesterday, the definition of sense dependence, Bob Brandon, Tales of the Mighty Day, page 41. Concept P and concept Q are sense dependent if and only if we can only grasp concept P if we can grasp concept Q. Okay, whereas, so the quote continues, concept P and concept Q are reference dependent if and only if something falls under P, if something falls under Q. Okay, those are different claims. For example, you know, my mental states are reference dependent on my brain, okay? Because if you were to cut out my brain right now, I wouldn't have mental states, okay? So there's a reference dependent between the two, whereas the dependence between my access to the notion of difference and my access to the notion of identity is one of sense difference. I only have access to the notion of identity because I have access to the notion of difference. And that's not some crazy French philosopher, that's Gottlob Frege. Okay? This is what ties Frege and Franz together. This can easily be shown if we take account of the difference between 3 plus 1 equals 2 plus 2 and 5 minus 1 equals 6 minus 2. To be precise, there are obviously transfinitely many ways of representing 4, where the sign 4 is used to refer to the in itself necessarily senseless reference of all senses that are truthfully of or about 4. Along this path, we could then think of identity as of an infinite equation. For example, 100 minus 1 equals 101 minus 2 equals 102 minus 3, and so on ad infinitum, in which particular case all senses seem to point to 99. Yet, 99 can itself figure in the equation so defined, even though I used a simple algorithm to represent the possibility of an infinite equation pointing to 99, where again 99 is only a stand-in for that which can only be referred to without itself referring to anything further. So obviously every number can be represented by an algorithm generating the number as that an infinite equation is of. Aboutness, and thus sense, only becomes salient in a plurality of fields of sense. But what is more, identity cannot exist independently of this plurality. The one is strictly speaking impossible. It can't exist. If it existed, it would have to appear in a field of sense, and as soon as it appeared in a field of sense, it would be affected by sense. It would be this rather than that one. Okay? I mean, that's good old Plato, of course. Okay? That's Plato's Parmenides. There's no one. Hen uk esti, there's no one. Of course, I won't go into wordplays, there's no one and so forth, okay. Of course, one could already have drawn this lesson from Plato's Parmenides or from Plotinus, but the obvious hermeneutical obstacle to such a reading is the assumption of ontological stability and homogeneity for the fields of sense involved in all varieties of ancient philosophy. Unbound existence, as the cosmologist Milton Nunes has called it, is thus impossible. The unbound doesn't exist, yet it manifests itself as a constitutive withdrawal in our attempt to make sense of sense-making. Intelligibility refers to itself in our reference to it. We are capable of becoming self-aware. This self-awareness generates a margin of ignorance where the withdrawal takes place. To be sure, the withdrawal withdraws. There is, of course, no singular theory of the withdrawal. In this respect, my ontology is self-consciously incomplete and finite. For this reason, the universal tenets ratified by my ontological basic assumptions cannot be universal in the sense of a transcendental truth, which is necessary and universal by definition. But what does this mean for the prospects of universalism? Platonism nourishes itself from what I call the paradigm of the ontological matrix, what Plato in the Sophists called the idea of being, idea tu ontos. A transcendental matrix would be a pre-established ontological structure, which is both necessary and universal, and therefore a priori in the strict Kantian sense of the term. Reference to this structure, though, would have to take place in an all-encompassing field of sense, a field of sense within which everything appeared. This field of sense has been called for more than 2,000 years the whole, totality, toholan. But such a field is impossible, as I've argued. Ontology remains as incomplete as reality, or, which is actually the more adequate parallel, as time. According to the traditional ontological paradigm of universality, a whole takes place such that everything is encompassed within its structure-giving rules. Traditional logic, in its association with metaphysics, set out to uncover this all-encompassing structure. Yet, such a structure can't exist, not even in the form of natural laws. We can approach the incompleteness of reality in the following manner. Okay, so let me just give you a last picture of the incompleteness of reality, and then we should get to a discussion. Let us postulate per impossibile that there is a structurally homogeneous spatial-temporal universe within which everything that exists takes place. Okay, there can't be such a thing because it would have to be complete and so forth, but let's imagine that there is such a thing. A structurally homogeneous spatial-temporal universe within which everything that exists takes place, took place, and will take place. Now, we can slice this universe up in a series of temporarily indexed photographs, as it were. So, we have a universe at a random time t1. In the universe at t1, I am typing this sentence: the sun is shining into my office, a dog is playing, someone's crying, some extraterrestrial creature is writing a weird theological treatise on Plotinus, someone is eating spaghetti, and so on. So let's say that this happened at t1. At t2, another set of events appear on the photograph. Now, the question is whether there is an all-encompassing law governing the transitional space between any two time slices. A good candidate would be, of course, the natural laws. They seem to define what comes next, okay? They seem to get you to the next page. However, any reference to those laws, for example, physics, puts them onto a photograph. And even if they were part of all photographs taken heretofore, this would not entail that they will be on all photographs in the future. I take this to be an irrefutable basic Humean lesson. However, one could argue that all these photographs have something in common. That is the form of the photograph, and argue that this form is captured by ontology. I think this is what Plato wanted, okay? That's the ancient difference between ontology and physics, or between metaphysics and physics. Metaphysics describes the logical form of the picture, whereas physics is the idea that all pictures have a transitional force in common, okay? So that's exactly Aristotle's point why physics and metaphysics are not the same. Okay, in physics you describe something, you know, which is inductively finite and so forth, Hume, and in ontology you somehow escape, transcend finitude, because you describe the logical form of the photograph. Okay. However, if we think of ontology in this way, we give a picture of it in its relation to all photographs, which is always only another photograph. Ex hypothesis, we have no, to quote McDowell, sideways on point of view. We are never in the position of the camera with respect to reality in its entirety, for the camera would itself have to be integrated into the picture, which is why this whole analogy naturally fails. There is no structure which governs the transitional space between all photographs, one of the reasons being that there is no such thing as all photographs. Which picture follows, which depends on the field of sense, and its constitutive rules we single out as the logical form of the photograph. Besides Borges, Fernando Pessoa, and I will close my whole story with reference to a poet, okay? You know, because to quote Hölderlin, in dangerous times the thing which might rescue us grows. So we need a big authority on our side, and I think Fernando Pessoa is a really big authority. And he's one of the poets who has seen this most clearly, even clearer maybe than Borges with his library. Okay, so of course I just did Borges' library, okay, for those of you who know Argentinian literature, which goes back again to a Leibniz metaphor. But I think Pessoa got it better. This is probably most impressively rendered in one of his English poems called The King of Gaps. Let me quote. There lived, I know not when, never perhaps, but the fact is he lives, an unknown king, whose kingdom was the strange kingdom of gaps. He was lord of what is twixt thing and thing, of interbeings, of that part of us that lies between our waking and our sleep, between our silence and our speech, between us and the consciousness of us. And thus, a strange mute kingdom did that weird king keep, sequestered from our thought of time and scene. Those supreme purposes that never reach the deeds, between them and the deed undone, he rules uncrowned. He is the mystery which is between eyes and sight, nor blind nor seeing. Himself is never ended nor begun. Above his own void, presence empty shelf. All he is but a chasm of his own being. The lidless box holding not being's no pelf. All think that he is God except himself. Thanks.